The situation in the Middle East changes so fast, and no one is more on top of it than Barry Rubin, whose perspective cuts through the fog like a lighthouse beam. There is perhaps no one able to speak more knowledgeably about the instability rocking the Middle East, both in the specifics and in the broadest context, than Barry Rubin. Dr. Rubin has been a Middle East writer and analyst for more than 30 years and is director of the Global Research in International Affairs Center. He has written 23 books, edited an additional 32 books, and is the editor of the Middle East Review of International Affairs Journal. There is literally not a topic in the Middle East that Dr. Rubin has not addressed, often in terms strikingly different than the conventional wisdom, and always with the analysis that proves to be more incisive and predictions that turn out to be more accurate than the conventional wisdom. I want to thank the Luxe Hotel for their gracious and generous contribution to making these events possible, and to the David Horowitz Freedom Center and the Republican Jewish Coalition for their co-sponsorship. As always, please turn off your cell phones and all your other electronic gadgetry that has become part of our lives. And it's with great honor that I present to you Dr. Barry Rubin.
Well, thank you for your warm hospitality. Just to get a couple of little things out of the way beforehand. My family comes from Dolhinov, which was in eastern Poland and now in Belarus, of which I've written a book, which probably I hope will be published around 2012, and on one side and Slovakia on the other side. If anybody's here from Slovakia or Dolhinov, let me know. I just mentioned to you that if you would like to receive our articles and publications, you can give me your email address after the talk also. And finally, I just want to mention that in August of this year, Yale University Press will publish my new book called Israel: An Introduction. And it basically is for the first time someone tried one volume to deal with all aspects of Israeli history and society. And I hope that a lot of people will read it and use it. And I hope it'll be featured at Jewish book fairs if anyone has any influence there. And then in 2012, Yale University Press will publish my book entitled Germany, the Nazis, and the Making of the Modern Middle East, which is based on thousands of pages of new archival material, which really blew my mind and changed my perspective on the history of the region. We have just vast amounts of stuff that no one has ever seen before. Okay, with that said, what I want to do, I have so much to say and time is limited. So I want to divide this into 4 sections. The first section is background to understand history to this point. The second is the strategic situation and the most important thing you need to know. The third is the most recent developments. And the fourth is the relationship to Israel. I'll talk about the relationship to the U.S. earlier on. So I'm going to try to bring out the main themes on each of these points. First of all, the background. The most important long-term issue in the Middle East has been, why are we behind? Why are we weaker than the West? Why don't we have higher living standards? And so on. And what can we do to change that? And historically, 3 basic ideas have been developed to answer that question. One of those ideas is the nationalist identity, Arab nationalism, which said the most important thing we need to do is to define ourselves as Arabs, to unite all the Arab world that can be united, to create strong central governments, even if they're dictatorships, and copying the Soviet and to some extent the Nazi German model, we will progress rapidly. The second movement was Islamism, which said what we need to do is to organize not around national identity but religious identity. We have to if we run our countries according to the Sharia law, and so on, then we will, because God will shine His countenance upon us and we will do well. And compared to these two powerful movements, the third movement, which is far behind, is what you can call liberal, democratic, pragmatic movement. And what we're seeing at this moment is really a new era in the struggle between these three basic ideas on how the Middle East should be changed. Before World War II, there were two main factions in the Arab world. The radical faction, which was both radical nationalist and Islamist, and the moderate faction, which believed in working more with the British and so on. It's a fascinating story. I don't have time to go into it. What's interesting is that during World War II, the radical faction supported the Axis. And the Axis lost the war. But what happened is that despite having backed the wrong side in the war, the radicals came out on top in the Middle East after the war. And since the morning of July the 23rd, 1952, when the Egyptian Free Officers staged a coup and seized control of Egypt, until now, the Arab world has been dominated by the Arab nationalists, who repressed the Islamists, and the Democrats basically joined up with the Arab nationalists or went out of business. Now, the Arab nationalists, in ruling the Arab world, made some promises. And the promises they made included the following. We will unite the Arab world, and they failed. We will destroy Israel, and they failed. We will make us so strong that the West is pushed out of the region, and they failed. And we will dramatically improve living standards and life for people, and then eventually we'll give more rights, and they failed. So from depending on the country, 1950 Egypt, you could say 58 Syria, 58 Iraq. Radical Arab nationalist regimes took power. And where they didn't take power, the monarchies had to adopt themselves to the radical regimes. So from 1950 to the present day, the Arab nationalist regimes have dominated. And when people talk about Mubarak as a dictator, Mubarak has ruled for 30 years, this reflects a basic misunderstanding of the situation. This regime has been in power in Egypt for 60 years. And it's gone through different phases, and there have been three dictators, Nasser, Sadat, and Mubarak. So the question is whether the fall of this dictatorship is the end of the story of Arab nationalism. I don't think it is. And now the battle between Islamism and pragmatic democracy. As it became clear that the Arab nationalist regimes had failed, particularly in the 80s and 90s, you got the Islamist movement arising. And the Islamist movement, with perhaps the exception of Tunisia, is the opposition it's the main opposition in every Arab country. The Islamists are well organized and disciplined. And both the Islamists and the nationalists have some very important advantages over, I'll just call them the liberals, if you will, the Democrats with a small d. I'll call them the reformers. The Islamists and the nationalists have very simple ideas. The idea of the reformers are much more complicated. The nationalists and the Islamists have ideas that are local. Islam, nationalism. The reformers are using ideas which are more obviously imported from the West. The reformers are more likely to appeal to people who are urban and middle class. The nationalists and the Islamists are more able to appeal to the masses. The nationalists and the Islamists have huge amounts of money. The reformists don't. The nationalists and the Islamists have political parties, radio and television, and newspapers. The reformists don't. So the reform, and there are other. I wrote a whole book on this called "The Long Road to Freedom." The reformists have a very uphill battle And by the way, remember that recently we've been told it's really easy, they've won, it's all over, there's going to be no problem. So that's the first part. That's the historical background. Let me sum it up in this way. And a lot of people laugh when I say this, but it's absolutely true. What is a simple way of defining the difference between these three groups? And the answer is the nationalists have been batting their heads against a stone wall for 50 or 60 years. The reformers say the answer is to stop hitting your head against a stone wall. The Islamists say your mistake is you didn't hit your head against the stone wall hard enough. And that's an accurate description. Let me move to the second part, the strategic part. The most important thing I can tell you about the Middle East today is that the central issue in the Middle East is this great struggle. And particularly the struggle between revolutionary Islamists on one hand and the nationalists and reformers on the other. The list of assets that the radical Islamists have gets bigger and bigger, and the list of assets that the nationalists and reformers have gets smaller and smaller. And here I just wish I had a blackboard, but I'll give you a sense of it. And by the way, remember, not all Islamists work together. They're not all on the same side. But if I were going to give you a list of the assets that the revolutionary Islamist forces and the anti-American forces and the most anti-Israel force, they're all anti-Israel, but the most anti-Israel force, here is the list of Islamists' assets. They rule Iran. They rule Syria. They now control Lebanon under Hezbollah-led government. They control the Gaza Strip under Hamas. They are allied with the current Turkish government. And they have Sudan. Now that's a long list, and it's a list that's been getting longer. What does the other side have? And by other side, I don't just mean people who aren't Islamists, but people who are ready to combat the Islamists in the Arab world. Well, you got Saudi Arabia, you got Jordan, you got Morocco, and then you have 5 very small sheikdoms. Oh, I'm sorry. Yemen has also tended to be on the Islamist side, even though it's not an Islamist state. And Qatar has tilted toward the Islamists. So when a Middle Easterner looks at the strategic battle, what he sees is that the list of assets and power of the Islamists keeps getting bigger, and the list of the opposition keeps getting smaller. And the opposition, of course, the Islamists has put its faith in the U.S., and has put its faith in the U.S., and the U.S. has not lived up to that bargain. Let me just tell you one of many anecdotes I could tell on this subject. In Lebanon, there is an important political leader named Walid Jumblat. Walid Jumblat is the leader of the Druze community, which is a small but a very important and strategic group. They have a very strong armed militia and so on. Walid Jumblat's father, who had the job before him, was murdered by the Syrians. So Walid Jumblat hated the Syrians. And at a time when there was a moderate government in power in Lebanon, Walid Jumblat was a big supporter of it. And he went on television, these are close to exact quotes, and the interviewer said to him, "Mr. Jumblat, is it true that you compared Syrian President Bashar al-Assad to a dog?" Which in the Arab world is a much greater insult. And here's what he said, literally word for word. He said, "Yes, I did, and I want to apologize to all the dogs who didn't deserve that comparison." Now, but now, Jumblat has changed sides. He went to Damascus. He made his bow to Bashar al-Assad, and he supported the Hezbollah government, played a key role in the Hezbollah-led government coming into power. Why? They asked him why, and he said, because they were ready to kill me, because they had plenty of support from Syria and Iran, and the U.S. and France didn't support us. So I had to bow to the inevitable. Now that's how Middle East politics works. And so if the Islamist side keeps growing in power, and remember that in this context, the way people look at it in the region is that Egypt has now gone from being the most important American Arab ally to a neutral at best, and possibly at some point in the future an Islamist state. So they view it as a big victory for their side. And you know what? The Saudis and the Jordanians and the Gulf Arabs view it the same way. This is not the way people view it in the U.S., I understand, but this is the way it's understood in the Middle East. So the perception is that Iran is winning, that the U.S. has no real response, that it's not a credible and reliable ally, that Iran at some point will get nuclear weapons. We now know that Iran is supplying rockets to the Taliban to kill Americans. We know it's from U.S. Defense Department reports. We know that Iran is supplying mines to the Iraqi insurgents to kill Americans. And we even know from U.S. government sources that in recent years Iran has helped Al-Qaeda. And the U.S. has no response, and doesn't even denounce it. So people in the region do not look at it the way that the people who write in the Los Angeles Times do. They have a totally different perspective. And even if the Los Angeles Times publishes articles from people in the Arab world, they never represent this perspective. But it's a funny thing now, because nowadays when I speak, and it's been very interesting doing this on college campuses, I say, I'm not speaking on behalf of Israel. I'm speaking on behalf of all the moderate forces in the region, including the Iranian opposition, the Turkish opposition, the Lebanese opposition, and so on. Because we are all in the same boat. We have parallel interests, although people won't say it publicly. Believe me, they say it privately to me all the time, that we face a common threat, and that's the threat of revolutionary Islamism. And we face a common need to get support from the U.S. and the West. And we share the common belief that we're not getting it. And that, by the way, the key issue in the Middle East is not the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It's not whether a zoning board in Jerusalem approves some buildings in 10 years. It's not the settlements. This is really it. It's been very interesting lately because I think for the first time we've gotten a really clear and detailed sense of what goes on within the Obama administration. I don't know if any of you read what I've written about this, but that there are two camps in the Obama administration. On the one hand, you have the state and defense departments, which represent a more traditional view. And these people have always, the basis of policy has been alliances with Arab states. And if they were critical of Israel, it was because they felt Israel got in the way of those alliances with Arab states. So how do they feel when the U.S. abandons its alliances with the friendly Arab states and then goes over and courts the radicals? They don't like it. And by the way, everything I say is not from reading the Los Angeles Times. It's like from talking to people. I'll tell you, I'll just be vague about it. I participated in an entire evening with State Department people and who were openly criticizing the White House, which I've never heard under this administration before. So Hillary Clinton is very unhappy. Robert Gates is very unhappy with what the administration has been doing. But if they understand basically what needs to be done, doesn't mean I agree with everything they say, but basically for a policy which is in the playing field of sanity, who's on the other side? And the answer is very ideological people on the White House staff, and by the way, Rahm Emanuel is of no importance in this, and Axelrod is of no importance in this, but mid-level NSC staffers who are brought in because Obama knows them, they have no real international affairs experience. In addition to them, the CIA, which for some reason has been pushing this. So what are the two basic conceptions of these two camps? The basic conception of the camp, which was dominant at least until about 48 hours ago at least, no, because because there has been some pulling back, basically goes like this. The U.S. must prove to, quote, Muslims, but everybody's a Muslim in the Middle East, so what does that mean? Not everybody, but most people are Muslims. So which Muslims? So the U.S. has to prove itself to Muslims and Arabs that it likes them, that it's their friend, and that it supports them. But the Muslims to whom it's being proven are not the Saudis and not the Jordanians and not the Gulfies. It's the Syrians and the more radical people. The U.S. made a big attempt to get along with Iran. They still haven't given up negotiating with Iran. They have an ongoing discussion. They have an ongoing relationship with Syria in which the U.S. makes concessions and the Syrians never make concessions, and they've been moving toward dealing with the Islamists. And I think the genuine conception is, and by the way, this is most clearly articulated by John Brennan, who is the President's advisor on terrorism, and Jones, the former National Security Advisor, is that they can somehow, that the only enemy of the U.S. in the world is Al-Qaeda. And anybody who isn't Al-Qaeda and therefore not staging direct terrorist attacks on U.S. territory or making as a very high priority attacks on Americans abroad is not the big problem. And what you need to do then is you need to isolate Al-Qaeda and get along with the good Islamists, and by the way, this includes the Taliban, elements in the Taliban, and you can work with them, and if they get into power, it's not a bad thing because they'll be moderated by being in power. And then they will accept democracy and so on and so forth. Now, this is a lunatic concept. But you don't need me. But I want to make it clear, this is not an Israeli perspective. I promise you that this is what I hear every day from people every day from people from Turkey and Lebanon, and several times a week from people from Jordan and Iran and from the smaller states and other places. They understand it. They know it. And it doesn't make any sense to them. It sounds like a really bad idea to them, too. But this is what we saw in Egypt. And if you're a really good audience, I'll tell you a couple of secrets which reflects some of the background on this that I saw firsthand. But this is what we saw. Now, how do you handle the crisis in Egypt? I mean, everybody knows who's dealt with diplomacy. You go to the Egyptian government and army and you say, look, Mubarak's 82 years old. He's going to be out of power soon. Get rid of him, save the regime, and make some reforms. And we will work with you and we will help you. That's how it's done. And instead, within literally, 48 to 72 hours of the start of demonstrations, to publicly call, without any consultations, to call publicly for the fall, not just Mubarak's departure, but the fall of the entire regime, to be replaced by something that nobody knows what it is. To say, you have to be out yesterday. They didn't consult with Israel. They didn't consult with Jordan. They didn't consult with Saudi Arabia. They didn't consult with anybody. And then to publicly announce, without anybody asking you, without any need to do so, that the U.S. would accept Muslim Brotherhood people in the government. Now, he didn't have, right, Obama said it. Now, he didn't have to say he was against it. He just didn't have to say anything. If it became an issue, then they could decide what to do. So this is like disastrous. And there are people within the Obama administration, within the government, who know that just as well as I do. There are a heck of a lot of people in the Middle East. And I said things like, well, what reason do the Saudis and the Jordanians and Morocco and other countries have to believe that the U.S. doesn't consider them dictatorships that it wants to overthrow? And it was literally only till about 4 days ago that it said, oh, we don't mean you. Actually, I can go into a lot more detail, but I don't want to become too boring and tell you precisely the turning point in this process. Well, the turning point, I think, was, well, you ask me. The turning point was Bahrain. Bahrain is a small island in the Gulf. Doesn't have any oil or gas, but it is the headquarters of the U.S. Fifth Fleet. And at first, it looked like the administration was going to call for the overthrow of the government of Bahrain. And State Department people pressed them and said that we've got to keep this government in power, because if it falls, you're going to get a pro-Iranian government, and the Fifth Fleet's going to get kicked out, and it's going to be a turning point in the history of the Gulf. So they persuaded the White House to support a attempt to have a compromise between the ruling family, with the Crown Prince doing negotiation, and the opposition. The trouble is that there's sort of a moderate opposition and a more radical opposition. The radical opposition would accept a compromise. Now, if you have to really know how to read newspapers, because the key things are buried. So if you read the article in the Wall Street Journal that discussed this, I think it was that article, there's one little phrase. The president was briefed on various things, and one of the things he was briefed on was Iranian influence in the Bahrain opposition. So obviously what they told him is, look, Iran has a lot, they're giving them money and has a lot of influence. So now they pull back a bit, but we still have to deal with the situation in Egypt. So let me now turn to the third point, which is the latest developments. I have been actually working on international affairs for professionally for 41 years. Amazing thing to say. And this is the worst covered and analyzed story I've ever seen in those 41 years. And if we had time, I could go on and give you point after point. The reporters got nothing but the most superficial stuff. They whitewashed the Muslim Brotherhood to a ridiculous extent. Look, this stuff is not top secret. Last October 7th, I wrote an article called "The Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood Declares Jihad on America. Will Anyone in America Notice?" And a lot of my friends after a week said, no, they didn't notice. What happened was, look, the Brotherhood has a very clear concept of revolutionary strategy. It's a two-stage process. There's the stage of dawah, which I'll call it doesn't really mean that, but I'll call base building. And then there's a stage of revolution. And they always said, we're in the stage of base building, we're in the stage of, because they knew that the army and the government would crush them and send them back to concentration camps to be tortured, which is what happened in the 1950s. But in early October of last year, the Supreme Guide, Muhammad al-Badi, gave this speech that just blew me away. He sounded like Osama bin Laden. And he said, it's the duty of all Muslims to participate in jihad. Jihad is against America and its allies, and of course Israel. And America is growing weaker, and it's falling apart, and now is the moment to strike. Now, in retrospect, I can't help but wonder what role that policy shift played in the events of a few weeks later. One among the many failings of the media and people on television and radio, I mean, they're pontificating over countries they know absolutely zero about. I mean, it's just even more extreme than I've ever seen it. And I don't know if any of you read my blog, My Experience with NPR, but if you remind me, I'll recount that as a case study of what goes on. Anyway, so one example of this is, we know that the revolution was initiated by something called the April 6th movement. Now, I have not yet seen any American newspaper or television station to really analyze the April 6th movement. It is quite true that the April 6th movement has a lot of members who are young, urban middle class, Facebook users, Twitterers, and want reform and democracy. That is absolutely true. But it's also true that people from people from 5 different groups participated in addition to the independents. Of those 5 groups, 2 of them are far-left anti-American parties. One of them was the Muslim Brotherhood as individuals, because they had a deal with the Muslim Brotherhood that it would not participate as an organization, but it could send individuals to participate. The 4th is a small, moderate Islamist offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood. And the 5th, it was the movement of Noor. The name is slipping me for a moment. Qadiyya. Which was taken over by the Muslim Brotherhood, and the head of it for several years was the leading anti-Semitic person in Egypt. Now you can imagine, to be the leading anti-Semite in Egypt takes some doing. So the point is that the group did have a lot of radical, both leftist radical and also Islamist-related connections. Again, that doesn't mean that there weren't a lot of people who were genuine reformers in it. But, for example, which you'll never read in the American media, the April 6th movement participated in an umbrella group, one of whose principles was abrogating the peace treaty with Israel. So no one has done this basic, simple research. I was writing this or something else relevant when I got an application to join my Facebook from a young, hip Egyptian Facebook user. And so I looked at his page, and on his page he had pictures of American singers, dressed as American female singers dress. And so you would think, well, this is a young, hip, liberal Facebook user. But if you read his personal statement, and I can paraphrase it, it went something like this. Being an Arab isn't important. Being an Egyptian isn't important. Your family and your clan are not important. The only thing important is Islam, and Egypt should be a Sharia state. And then he opened and closed his personal statements with quotations from Sayyid Qutb, who's one of the radical ideologues of Islamism. So I said, well, not everybody who uses Facebook has to be, a reformer. I actually think this guy was recommended to me as a sincere reformer by someone who put him in touch with me, and that's why he wrote me. So it shows how careless people are in examining these things. Now, every country is different. I think Tunisia has a chance of making it. It has a relatively strong urban middle class. It has a lot of people who are relatively moderate and pragmatic, and it has a very weak Islamist movement proportionally. So I think Tunisia may succeed in doing it. But Egypt is a different matter. If I ask myself how many young, hip, reformist Facebook users there are, I would say 100,000 in Cairo and Alexandria. How many Egyptians are there? 86 million. Are these people going to support such a liberal party? And the answer is no. I've been predicting for some time, and now, as of yesterday, I can say that it's accomplished fact, that there are 2 main candidates in the presidential election in Egypt. And one of them is Mohammed el-Baradei. He is the former head of the International Atomic Energy Agency, and so on and so forth. Now, the problem is that although he's gotten a very good press in the West and in the U.S., his movement is almost totally dependent on the Muslim Brotherhood for activists and so on. Not completely. There are democratic reformers, but the Brotherhood will not run its own presidential candidate. So let's say, reasonably, the Brotherhood controls 25%, maybe 20% of the vote, 25% of the vote. So they'll vote for him. But who else will vote for him? Not a lot of people, I don't think. Maybe he'll get 5% vote from reform-minded people. So he is a client of the Brotherhood. As a friend of mine in Cairo said when we were discussing, everybody in Egypt knows that. I said, nobody in America knows that. The other candidate is Amr Moussa. Amr Moussa, very interesting guy, was a career Egyptian diplomat. If you will go to my blog, I published an article today saying, "Meet Egypt's new president." Amr Musa is a real character. He worked closely with Mubarak. This is very ironic that they're going to elect a guy who's very much part of the old regime. But he is, in many ways, an old-style Arab nationalist, and he's absolutely fixated on the Arab-Israeli conflict and the Palestinian issue. I mean, in some ways, more than any other leading politician in Egypt, which again says something. And I think he'll win. I gave 6 reasons. You want to hear them? Why I think he'll win? No? Okay. I have to figure out how to spend my time. Number 1, he's a well-known and popular figure. Number 2, his opponent isn't, and his opponent was out of the country for 30 years. Number 3, a lot of Egyptians don't want Islamism, and they will vote against Blvd because they don't want the Brotherhood. Number 4, he's a much better politician and speechmaker. Number 5, he knows how to play up demagogically the America and Israel issues. Oh, and number 6, all Mubarak's supporters will vote for him, in my opinion. So I figured, I could be wrong here, I figure he'll win. Let's say he gets 50%, Blvd gets 30, 35, and leftist parties get 10, and there's a small moderate Islamist party will get a few, won't amount to much. That's just a rough guess. But I think Amr Musa will be the next president of Egypt. And what does that mean? Well, it's better than having an Islamist government. But Amr Musa does not love the United States. He doesn't view, his view of Egyptian interests is not that Egypt be allied with the U.S. And he hates Israel, and he's made a career out of baiting Israel. So much so that in 2001, I think there was a famous Egyptian song that went to the top of the hit parade in which the key lines were, "I hate Israel, I love Amr Musa." Now there's a tremendous irony here, because I remember, for example, a very interesting meeting that I know about after Camp David in 2000, when American officials went to brief Mubarak and Amr Musa was in the room. And I'll tell you this story if we have time. So this guy is going to be trouble. He doesn't want to go to war with Israel, but we have to ask ourselves, what's likely to happen in Egypt? The stuff I'm telling you, forgive me for saying this, stuff I'm telling you is better than anything you're reading in the media. But it shouldn't be that way, because they should know the same things that I'm saying. Okay. People of Egypt will be very happy. The dictatorship's gone. They have more freedom. That's very significant, and that will hold people for a while. But what happens in 2 or 3 years when they're not able to raise living standards? Remember, this is a key factor. People want jobs. People want housing. And the price of food, for various reasons, is going up. I joke that the true father of the Egyptian revolution was Al Gore. That the price of food, so they have to have subsidies. Well, where is the money going to come from to create jobs, to build housing, to subsidize each loaf of bread? They don't have it. And there's nowhere they can get it from. If you note that the Palestinian Authority received $3 billion in foreign donors' aid for a population of 2 million people, then to have the equivalent, which didn't make everybody rich, of course there's a lot of corruption, there'll be a lot of corruption in Egypt. To do that for Egypt, the equivalent amount would cost $120 billion. Remember that, $120 billion. And by the way, you know that the U.S. government announced that to help transition to democracy, they were giving an additional $150 million aid. So you need $120 billion, and they get $150 million. You do the math. Now, the U.S. isn't going to supply billions of dollars more. The Europeans aren't. They have to bail out Portugal and Greece. They have their own problem. The Saudis aren't going to do it because they are very unhappy with the situation, and they hate Amr Musa. They hate him. There's nowhere the money's going to come from. So it's reasonable to predict that in 2 or 3 or 4 years there's going to be a big crisis in Egypt. As discontent grows, where's the better life we were promised? And then one of three things is going to happen. Number one, the second government will be a brotherhood government. Number two, that the Amr Musa government will use repression. Or number three, that it will do the old tactic which has been used by Arab nationalist regimes since 1950, and Amr Musa is really one of these people. He's the last of them, in a sense, even though he's not that old. And that is demagoguery. Scapegoat U.S., scapegoat the West, scapegoat Israel, and get people all hysterical over that. I'm betting on door number three. But it's a lot better than the Islamist government. Now, people are very naive. I mean, by the way, despite what I'm going to say, I'm not at all pessimistic. No. Why am I not at all pessimistic? For lots of reasons. Because Israel's strong, the economy's doing well, the country's relatively united by Israeli standards. But also because there are limits. There are also real limits, and Amr Musa is aware of this. There are just many details that we have to talk about. And again, I've not seen this discussed in any American newspaper, on any American television show. Number one, what happens if the Egyptians violate the agreement and shut off the gas? Or they demand that the price be greatly increased? Will the U.S. intervene to say, well, you made a contract? Number two, more importantly, Israel in 3 or 4 years will have its own natural gas. Number two, more importantly, what if Egypt violates the agreements in the... See, they're not going to tear up the peace treaty and throw it away. That'd be too obvious. What if they send more military forces into Sinai in violation of the agreement? And Israel goes to the White House and says they're violating the agreement, make them observe it. Is the U.S. government going to pressure them and threaten to cut off aid and have a confrontation in defense of that treaty? Number three, and we're already seeing, the AP reported it today, I reported it 2 weeks ago, we know that arms smuggling into Gaza is increasing. And it will increase. And it will increase because, as I explained to one government official, that it doesn't matter what the generals back in Cairo say. The officers are sympathetic to Hamas on the scene, many of them, and they'll take bribes. So, this is happening. And they'll be able to get more military equipment, which means that they'll be able, if they decide in the future to launch attacks on Israel, which means that Israel will retaliate. And then we have to ask ourselves a very interesting question. What would Egypt do? They probably wouldn't do anything, but we can't assume that they wouldn't do anything. So there are literally 10 or 15 different issues that this opens up, that nobody in the U.S. government seems to have given any thought, that nobody in the media seems to have discussed. Israeli concerns are only brought up to be dismissed as ridiculous, in the belief that everything is going to be okay. And I said that this reminds me of the scene, I don't know how many of you saw this film years ago, the film Easy Rider, in which the two guys on their motorcycles visit a hippie commune. And they're planting crops. And these people are so ignorant of agriculture that they just throw the seeds on the ground. They don't even bury them in the soil. So one of the guys turns to the other and says, I think they're going to make it. Well, no. There are lots of problems. Now, when I originally started writing about this, the first article I wrote about the Egyptian Revolution was, I'm really worried because nobody else is. And the point I wanted to make is that I would feel a lot better if people were aware of these threats and problems and talking about them. And there are ways that Obama and the way that other people could have done it. They could say, this is really wonderful, this is great, we really support the people who want democracy, but we are also aware that there are radical Islamists who want to destroy democracy, so we have to help, the good guys against the bad. I mean, some sense that there's a struggle going on here and not everybody is a friend. We didn't get that. And I can tell you so many anecdotes. I'll tell you two. How much time do I have? Okay, let me tell you a couple of anecdotes then. Even though I've worked on Egypt for almost 30 years and I've written 2 books on Islamists in Egypt, basically I was not interviewed by any mass media. Now I'm not saying that at a personal pique. I'm just sort of amazed. Now there are 2 exceptions to that. One exception was by a newspaper I won't mention, in which one of the journalists in New York called me up and said, I'm really worried because our correspondent in Cairo is hanging out with the Muslim Brotherhood people and saying how great they are, and they're just such wonderful people, and he likes them so much. I'm not exaggerating. And I said, well, okay, look, there's this and this and this and this and this. And eventually the person wrote an article but didn't mention any of the points I made. The other time is I was invited on NPR, an NPR show. So I said, just before we started the tape, who am I going to be on with? And they told me. And I literally said, because my staff assistant was standing there, oh no, I know what's going to happen. So it was this guy, what is he? I don't know where he's from. Anyway, he poses as a moderate, but he's just a total propagandist. So they said to him, well, what do you think of the situation in Egypt? And he said a couple sentences. And then he went off into a long diatribe against Israel and how everything was Israel's fault and the settlements and U.S. So I said, so then they said to me, and what do you think of the Israel, what is your view of Israeli view of the Egyptian revolution? I said, stop. I'm not participating in this. He did not deal with the subject. He made a propagandist speech. I'm not going to participate in this program. You're not even giving me a chance to respond. It's just propaganda. So I hung up the phone. And they called back, oh, we're sorry. The executive producer of the program called me and said, I apologize, you were right. And we will call you back in an hour and interview you one-on-one. So I said, fine. They never called me back and they never wrote me. Now that's not professional. And the end of the story is really funny. The end of the story is another program called me up 3 days later and said they wanted me to be on. I said, fine, who are you going to have me on with? And it was the same guy. You can read about it. So this was not really... Now, the thing is, there's no mystery here. What's his name? I want to say Taha Ramadan, but that's not it. That's an old Iraqi politician. Tariq, thank you. Tariq wrote an op-ed piece in the New York Times in which he was allowed to say, it's an op-ed piece, but still, that the Muslim Brotherhood was an anti-fascist organization before and during World War II. So I wrote the New York Times a letter, and I said, I happen to have all the German documents and the CIA documents, and we have the German documents in which they record German military intelligence giving them a lot of money, and the specific people who the press attaché, who was an Abwehr, German military intelligence guy, and the people he gave it to, and they gave it to the Muslim Brotherhood. And of course they didn't print the letter. The point is that the whitewashing of the Muslim Brotherhood is insane. This is a group. We have a record for 40, 50 years of their speeches, of their publications. I mean, the most anti-Semitic stuff, destroy Israel, hate America, jihad, and so on. It's not a mystery. And yet barely, there was actually one journalist, I don't remember his name, but a really good piece in the Los Angeles Times, which I think was an op-ed piece, but by a journalist who worked for the Los Angeles Times, which was the best article I read by any American journalist, because he actually did he mentioned the platform. They released a platform, 3 years ago? And the platform calls for a Sharia state, and the most important thing is, and this surprised me because it really is copying Iran, that there be a council of clerics who would decide what legislation was in line with Islam, and therefore could therefore be passed. This is in English, this is translated, this is available. and no one mentioned it. This is incredible to me. I'm just totally bewildered, frustrated, and angry. I mean, I can disagree with people and respect them. But when they cut out everything that contradicts their thesis and only report the news that they feel like, and when the head of national intelligence can say the Muslim Brotherhood is a secular organization, and you know, the thing about these are, you know why they have to have a monopoly? Because their arguments are so fragile that I could destroy them in 3 minutes or 2 minutes each. Let's take one. The Muslim Brotherhood has renounced violence. Over and over again we saw that. It's not true. The Muslim Brotherhood renounced the use of violence in Egypt because it was a precondition to Sadat allowing them to function in the 70s. They've always supported Palestinian terrorism. They've supported Iraqi terrorism against Americans. And they've supported other terrorism. So, you know. Now, they do some clever things. Their English language website is very moderate. In fact, they've now taken off their symbol with the cross swords. They've cleaned the website so it looks very moderate. They republished an article of mine on their website and critiqued it in a respectful way. But that's not what they say in Arabic. So I could tell you detail after detail, I won't try your patience much longer, about how fakakta this is. I mean, the deputy head, I posted a blog, the deputy head of the Muslim Brotherhood made a statement saying that he favors abrogating the treaty with Israel, and people in the U.S. quoted that as proof that they accepted the treaty with Israel. I mean, it's as if much of the policy elite has taken dumb pills, or there's been some kind of disease which has reduced their mental capability. Again, you can have disagreements, you can argue different sides, but for goodness sake, you got to deal with the facts and realities. I mean, as you can tell, I could go on for hours, and I could talk about Iran as an example of this also. But let me conclude with this point. The main threat in the Middle East today is revolutionary Islamism. The main threat is not Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda can stage terrorist attacks and kill people. Revolutionary Islamism can take over countries with dozens of millions of people, rule them, and get their entire assets. Not only Israelis know this, but many, many people in the Arab world know this. People in Iran sure know this. And people in Turkey, which has been moving toward Islamism, even though it's not reported here, know this. We are united in our understanding of the situation. The requirement is, the lacking ingredient is American leadership. That what the U.S. needs to do, quote unquote, I hate it when people say needs to do because it's very pompous, but should do, and I wrote this if you're ever interested in January of 2009 in great detail, I mean what I'm telling you now, is to become the leader of a broad and loose coalition with Europe and Morocco and Algeria and hopefully Tunisia and Saudi Arabia and Oman and United Arab Emirates and Kuwait and I don't know if I said Israel, the opposition in Lebanon, the opposition in Turkey, the opposition in Iran. If I left out anybody, I'm sorry. And to wage this struggle with revolutionary Islamism, which threatens to reopen for 40 or 50 years a new period of dictatorship, war, violence, and horror. Now, I said, but from the Israeli point of view, Israel can defend itself. Israel can deal with these things. These other countries can't. So that's the problem. It's not a short-term problem. It's not a problem of U.S.-Israel relations. It's a long-term strategic problem which has to be dealt with in order to preserve U.S. and Western interests in the region and the interests of the people who live in the region who don't want to end up under some new version of the Taliban or Ahmadinejad, who, by the way, is getting stronger in Iran. This is the reality. So I feel like I'm speaking to you in 1936 or 37 or 1946 and 47 about communism in the Soviet Union. I mean, we've been through this twice. We've actually been through it more than twice. I mean, you would think that people would begin to get the idea by now. Thank you very much. Russia deals with Hezbollah in Lebanon. They deal with Hamas, and of course with Iran and Syria. And they have basically chosen that side, and they get some things for it. The Iranians have never supported radical Islamism within Russian borders. So, but that's another aspect. And I feel, and many people in Central Europe feel, that this brings us together in common interests on these issues. On his first day in office, Mubarak comes down for his driver to drive him to office. The driver says, well, Mr. President, which way do you want me to drive you to the office? And Mubarak says, well, how did Nasser go? And the driver says, Nasser always turned left. And then he asked, how did Sadat go? And he said, Sadat always turned right. And then Mubarak thinks a moment and he says, signal left, signal right, then park. Now that joke is, goodness, I mean, that, excuse me, that's like 25 years old. So that's a simple way to put it. But Sadat opened the economy, and he also let the Brotherhood come back because he wanted to use them to counter the threat from the left he was facing, the left Nasserists at the time. But remember, Sadat is not popular at all in Egypt. Nasser, despite the fact that he led Egypt into the disastrous 67 war and was very repressive and sent the Brotherhood people to concentration camps in the desert, some of which, by the way, as our book will show, were run by former Nazis, is very popular. So this idea of, I mean, if there's a place in the world where nice guys finish last, this is the region where it's true. Well, look, let's talk about the Israel-Palestinian conflict. And I'm going to say this briefly, and I'm not going to offer you all the documentation, but I can produce it. The reason why there's not peace is because Palestinian leadership doesn't want to and cannot make peace, post-Arafat. And there are really clear reasons why that's so. It's not just they're bad people. There are clear reasons. They do not have a mandate. They have not prepared their people. We saw what happened during the Palestinian Papers thing when, these people had to hide for their lives when it was reported that they had made a couple of possible concessions which they then took back, which they had already long ago taken back. So, aside from Fayyad, who stays as the prime minister because the donors demand it, and Mahmoud Abbas, who's a complicated guy, he's relatively moderate by Fatah terms, but they're just things he can't do, he won't do. Almost every other leader in Fatah is pretty hard line. And they do not. It's complicated. Look, I'll tell you a story. I sat in the office of a general. When the Fatah had its last Congress, I sat in the office of a general, and every time they announced a name on the Fatah Central Committee, I'd say, that person's a hardliner, and he'd say, yes, but we can work with them. And we both knew what we meant. I meant, they're a hardliner, they'll never make a comprehensive peace. And he meant we can deal with them on interim arrangements and on the day-to-day stuff. So we were in total agreement. But when Fatah had its Congress, I analyzed every person who was elected. When I look at Google and stuff and I try to get more information on Palestinian politics and stuff, I'm the only person who's listed. Everything's a reprint of what I read because no one else did it. So, I don't say that to brag, I say that because I'm unhappy about it. So, we were told in the media that these were young, moderate people. It's not true. I don't remember exactly. I think of the 22 members, There may have been one moderate. I think he's the one who came in last. And then they announced they misquoted and kicked him off and put on the next guy. There are two groups, basically. There are ideological hardliners and there are Arafat's people. Those are really the two. And then Abbas maybe has like 3 or 4 votes out of 22. So this is still a hardline organization. And they still hope that they believe that it's better to wait decades and generations and leave open the possibility of getting everything than to make a comprehensive peace. And now they've hit on the perfect strategy for them, which is you go to the UN and all these countries and ask them to recognize you. So you don't have to make an agreement with Israel. You don't have to make any concessions or compromises. Now, I don't think it's going to work for them, but it makes sense for them. So this is the reality, to understand the Palestinian politics, to see what they're putting in their newspapers every day, which, by the way, again, you never see in the American media. You can look at Palestinian Media Watch, for example, does a good job. And, this is the problem. Now, in the year 2009, the Israeli cabinet passed Israel's official peace plan. And I have not seen this quoted anywhere in the mass media to this day, with one very partial exception. And there are 5 points. Point number 1, that the Israel position under Prime Minister Netanyahu, with the support of the whole coalition, we are ready to accept the 2-state solution with an independent Palestinian state, and here's what we want. Number 1, we want recognition of Israel as a Jewish state, and that's the only one that's ever mentioned in the media to ridicule it. But after all, remember, this was the basis of the UN partition resolution. In addition to that, I've actually read the Palestinian Constitution, and the opening line of the Palestinian Constitution is, Palestine is an Arab state, its official religion is Islam with respect for other religions. So it's an Arab Muslim state. Okay, so that's point number 1. Point number 2, security guarantees to be worked out. Point number 3, that all refugees must be resettled in the state of Palestine. Because if you're a nationalist, these people, by these people I mean academics, journalists, government officials, can't even figure out the following simple point. If you're a nationalist and say, we want a country of our own, we want a country of our own, we want a country of our own, you don't then say, oh, and by the way, we want to take hundreds of thousands of our people and send them to your country. That doesn't make sense. It only makes sense if the goal is to destroy Israel. Because what kind of nationalist wants his people to go to another country? Now, what I just told you was like one of about 30 or 40 or 50 points I made. Isn't that something that makes some sense? Isn't that something you think somebody would figure out and write about? Number 4, that it be a non-militarized state. And I always miss the 5th one. Anyway, this is not mentioned at all. So this is the problem. We are in such an irrational situation that despite the fact that for 2 years and 3 months the Palestinian Authority has refused to negotiate seriously with Israel, all we ever read is the Palestinians want peace and Israel doesn't. That's a matter of public record. They broke off the talks at Operation Cast Lead, so it was January of 2009. This is a fact. And remember when Obama went up in front of the UN in September of 2009 and said in 3 months we're going to have serious negotiations in Washington, and Netanyahu said yes and Abbas said no. Over and over again. And a non-Jewish friend of mine from Russia said it's like being back in the Soviet Union and reading Pravda and Izvestia. And at times I understand what he means. So it's not a matter of anti-Israel or pro-Israel. For me, it's a matter of cover the news accurately and have some degree of balance. I'll take 30-70. I'll take 25-75. But I don't want to take 0-100. And that's not that much of an exaggeration, regarding a lot of things. If I had time, I'd run through the argument on Iran nuclear with you. I'd run through the argument on winning Syria away from Iran. You could just take these one after another, and in 3 minutes show that what we're being told is absolute nonsense. So someone asked me, okay, I won't go into that. We'll ask yes, I do believe that the Secretary of State and the Secretary of Defense, even if they wouldn't agree with everything I say, understands basically the points I'm making and are horrified by the stuff they're seeing. I'll tell you, here's a little piece of evidence. Every 4 years, the U.S. military does something called the Quadrennial Review, which is their most important public statement. See, I actually read this stuff. That's how you learn things. It's amazing. Someone said to me before the extent to which these people don't do any research. The last report is 91 pages long. In that 91 pages, the word Islam or Islamism, I don't think Iran and nuclear weapons are mentioned. I think there's 5 to 7 pages on their attempts to reduce fuel consumption to have a greener military. 91 pages, nothing. At the end, it's a 3.5-page statement by the head of the Admiral Mullen, the head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. You read that statement, and he says, our main military threat is Iran. And you know how this works. Everybody puts in their paragraphs. The Army is concerned that Iran could use missiles against U.S. staging areas in the Gulf. The Navy is concerned about being attacked in the Strait of Hormuz or the Gulf by small Iranian naval ships swarming on them. The Air Force is concerned, and this is a funny thing, the Air Force is concerned at the Iranians giving anti-American insurgents or terrorists advanced anti-aircraft missiles. Now, why did I smile? Because in Foreign Affairs, there was a terrible article about containing Iran. And so one of the points they made is we know, this is like the low level of stuff being done now. We know that Iran will not give nuclear weapons to terrorists because they've never given advanced anti-aircraft weapons to the Iraqi insurgents. And my response is, here is the official U.S. military's report that says they've given advanced anti-aircraft weapons to Hezbollah. It's there. And you know what their response was? My response was, you shouldn't, obviously it was a more complex, it was, you shouldn't listen to anything he says because he doesn't like Obama. And this is in the most prestigious American journal. They did not respond to any of my arguments. Now, I think this article reflected the American administration's conception of containing Iran. I'm not against containing Iran. But what does it mean? Containing Iran does not just mean putting up some early warning station and missiles to protect the Saudis and then Israel. It means what I said earlier, which is that the most dangerous thing is not nuclear weapons. The most dangerous thing is the subversion and the terrorism, the money, and the ideology, which is gradually turning the region into an Islamist stronghold. And there's no conception of countering that, except Hillary Clinton said that the American media should be more like Al Jazeera. I've watched Al Jazeera. Let me tell you what an interview show is like in Al Jazeera. There are two people, the radicals and the moderates. The radical person and the moderate person, whatever the issue. The radical the thing begins. The host sides with the radical person, and both of them attack the moderate. And then they take, I'm not exaggerating, and then they take phone calls, and the phone calls threaten the moderate that they're going to kill him and he's a horrible traitor. Over and over again. I had a friend who was on it, one of the shows. He said, well, it was better than I thought. I thought it would be 100% against me. It's only 99%. So, this is like what you're holding up. Now, just to show how ignorant these people are. Al Jazeera is number one. What's number two? Al Arabiya. Al Arabiya was created by the United Arab Emirates to counter Al Jazeera. And Al Arabiya is a much more moderate, it's a much better station. But she didn't mention Al Arabiya, she mentioned Al Jazeera. It's like, what can I say? It's like, you can't believe this stuff goes on. And if you really know the details, it becomes much more unbelievable. and much more amazing. But there's some very good people in state. There's some very good people in defense. There's some very good people in the uniformed services. And they can have an effect, as we've seen in the last 3 or 4 days, but they're not basically making the main decisions. I mean, if you go into the detail, I'm sorry, I don't want to bore you, but consider what is the real impact of President Obama's Cairo speech. No, I mean, really, it's something no one understands. No one understands here, but everybody understands in the Middle East. For 50 years, remember how I began this talk, the dominant point of identity was Arab, national. And in this speech, the President of the United States is speaking and defining the Middle East and the Arab world in terms of religion, Islam. He was undermining, he thought he was helping the reformists, but he was undermining the nationalists. And he was basically urging them to change their main point of identity. So, I don't know if you know this, but I said, at the end of one of my articles, I said, if you really want to understand the current American foreign policy, watch this. And it was a link, I don't know if any of you remember, the original Fantasia version of The Sorcerer's Apprentice. Okay, so you know what I mean. It's just incredible. And I'm going to tell you this. I'm trying to think because the camera is rolling. Let me be vague. This is not just an Israeli thing. The president of country, these are non-Middle Eastern countries. The president of country, and I know this firsthand, someone who was in the meeting. The president of country A went to country B. These are both small countries. They are like 10, 12,000 miles apart. They have no connection whatsoever. They don't have trade, the culture, nothing. So the president of country A comes into the office of country B, and what do they talk about for an hour? About how they've lost confidence in the United States. Each of these two countries, again, these are non-Middle Eastern, has somebody they're worried about. A country they're worried about. And they don't believe the U.S. is going to defend them against it. So, people will try to make this into an Israel thing. It is not an Israel thing. Okay? It's like, even South American thing, Asian thing, Central European thing, in some cases Western European thing, with the French government. This is very serious.
I was curious what you thought was going to happen in September when the UN gets together for their 10-year anniversary. Are they just going to sell Israel down the river?
Well, they would if they could. But, no, I think that they will find procedural grounds not to admit. I mean, even though I think that the Obama administration will oppose and will veto if necessary. They have things like one of the most basic rules of a country is a country has to have control of the territory it claims. I mean, there's just lots of stuff. So I think this is going to fail. But you see, the thing, if you're doing your work, it's not hard. I wrote a piece and I said nothing is going to happen in the peace process in 2011. Nothing. Why? Well, there are a lot of reasons. But one reason is because the Palestinians don't want to talk to Israel. They want to push this. And they're going to be working on it until November, almost the end of the year. So they're not going to negotiate. They're not going to come to the table. Now, if I can figure that out, and I think that's true and accurate, why can't the LA Times, the New York Times, and all these highly paid people with their research assistants and their prestige, nothing could be more obvious. You see, that's why they do such a bad job of prediction. Yogi Berra once said, predictions are very hard, particularly about the future. And I've certainly made mistakes, although afterward I could justify them by saying up to a certain point it was right. But the point is, they do so badly. And they are wrong over and over again, and it just doesn't have an impact. That's what's truly amazing. My professional training is very academic, and Enlightenment values, and you look at the evidence, you have to prove your assertion, and then that world just seems to have suddenly disappeared. I haven't really lived in this country in real sense for like more than 20 years. So for me, it just hit me all at once. It wasn't like a day drip thing. I mean, when Princeton University Press, which was in my day the most prestigious press on the Middle East, that once published a 600-page book on land tenure in Syria, about which there's a great story if we have time, publishes a book by an anti-Israel British psychologist who's leader in the boycott movement, whose thesis is that Zionism is a mental illness. When Harvard University Press at a meeting cancels a book project because it says we can't have an Israeli writing about Arab politics, which I know because it happened to me. When these institutions which we believe in stop doing their... I mean, I could go on about university publishers for some time. I mean, but you know what? Yes and no. One of the amazing things that's happened that nobody's noted is, in terms of campuses, look, when I used to speak on campuses years ago, there would always be Arab students who had studied usually at Arab universities. And they had really studied the history, and they made points, and they used the basic methodology of scholarship. And we might completely disagree, but we could have a real conversation even in disagreeing. And suddenly I realized that one of the changes that's happened is that the Islamists have taken over. And even though the faculty people may be left, they're not supporting the Arab nationalists, they're supporting the Islamists. So one experience I tell about at a university, I was giving a talk, and a guy was sitting in the front row wearing the biggest Palestinian keffiyeh I ever saw. And as I was speaking, he was nodding vigorously every time I made a point. And it really threw me off. And then afterward he came up to me and said, look, I want a state. I support the Palestinian Authority. And all these people are Hamas supporters. And they're ruining our people. They're destroying our chance to get a state. And I've had a number of experiences like that. So that's another bizarre thing, which is, I can understand if someone wants to be against Israel and support the PA and this two-state solution. But how can these people justify supporting Hamas and Hezbollah? And you have to know the subtlety. So what do my Lebanese friends read every article about Lebanon that appears in the New York Times, and they invariably point out that every single person quoted is a Hezbollah supporter, which no reader of the newspaper would know. So that's part of this also, this switch to supporting the Islamists. But this also means that we can find common cause not only with the pro-democratic moderates, but also with a lot of the nationalists who hate and fear the Islamists. So in that sense, there's a great opportunity here. Remember something about Israel's strategic situation. Every day between the end of the 48 war in January, February 1949, and certainly 1980, in some ways 1990, on any given day, Israel could have been attacked by the armies of all the neighboring states. And that's not true anymore. And there are parallelisms. Saudi Arabia, which we can say a lot of things to criticize Saudi Arabia, and there's a tremendous anti-Semitism in Saudi Arabia, but they were trying to keep Hezbollah out of power in Lebanon for their own interests. So things have been mixed up. The central issue in the region is not the Arab-Israeli conflict. This is at best 20 or 30 years out of date. This is not what's going on at all. And so the obsession with this issue, with the settlements or the peace, after the Egyptian revolution, we're really going to have peace negotiations. In other words, after Israel is discovering that when it made major concessions and signed a peace treaty 30 years ago, there comes a Pharaoh who knows not Joseph, that there's a new government, and they can say, we're going to tear it up. Oh, right, that's the moment we're going to choose to pull out all the West Bank and turn it over to PA. And what happens if Hamas takes over in the future, or the next president? By the way, the next president, we don't know, but the successor is a guy named Mohammed Ghanim. None of you have ever heard of him, right? Mohammed Ghanim. He's a designated successor to Abbas. He got the most votes in the election for the Fatah Central Committee. He's so hardline that he called Arafat a traitor for signing the Camp David agreements. See, this is a point of fact, you know, and you can do the research easily on internet. So what? And he is the protege of not Karadawi, the guy who was one of the 3 Fatah representatives on the PLO executive committee. He's very elderly now. He's the most popular Fatah person. No, he's not the most popular. He's the least popular person. All right, not important. And he once said, it's better not to have a state than to give up any territory, even if it takes decades. So, Farouk Kadumi. So, you know, I mean, I'm not the only one who can dig this out. You know, they could dig it out. They could do these analyses, and they don't. I think one reason is ignorance and laziness and ideology, and they don't really have much understanding of the Middle East. Remember, the most interesting thing said during the Egyptian Revolution internationally is Mubarak said, Obama doesn't understand Arab culture. And I thought, what did he mean by that? And to me, it's obvious what he meant was, if you show people you're weak and you make concessions, they will drive over you with an 18-wheeler. Now, in American culture, I'll be very brief. In American culture, the most important thing is to prove you're nice, honest, decent person. And there's the concept of the win-win solution. You compromise, I compromise. This is not how Middle East politics works. Not at all. Well, we live in an era when it's practically a thought crime to suggest. It's very strange because on the one hand we have multiculturalism, but on the other hand we have a view that if you actually say that any culture really thinks any different from any other culture, that proves you're a racist. So it's a bit of a contradiction. So the only difference in multiculturalism is that these people eat different foods. I mean, the fact is, I've never found an Arab who was a big fan of Edward Said's thesis that the West was imperialist and racist because it thought Arabs were different. It thought differently and had a different history and culture and tradition. They like Said because he bashes the West and says they're victims and they're in the right. But you'll never see anyone adopting that view, which is the dominant view in the U.S. now. I'm sorry I went on so long. We have seen in our lifetimes, America is a country that changes like a pendulum. I mean, think about it. You know, you had... let's go back, and Bill Clinton was president, and then people switched to George W. Bush. So that's a big. Then they switched from George W. Bush to Obama, and you can go back further. So America's swinging all the time. So this is not like the end of history, to quote my friend Francis Fukuyama. I mean, there will be more changes in future. And people react against things. People reacted against the Vietnam War, and then that put them in one direction. And then they reacted against September 11th, and that pushed. Then they reacted against the Iraq War. So Americans are more changeable almost than anybody. So I don't think this is a permanent state. Also, you know, you're dealing with, I hate to say it because it applies to me and a lot of people in the audience, you know, this is the revenge of the 60s generation. And that's a transient thing also. So I'm not. But I said today to a number of people that the central question is the following: is the American, and this is not my field, but I'll just, in case you want to think about it, is the American crisis of decline due to bad leadership and bad decisions, and therefore it's relatively easily reversible, or is it due to fundamental and structural changes which are inevitable and which cannot be reversed? And I don't claim to know the answer to that. We can also apply that to Europe, where I'm afraid the answer may seem more likely. And nobody knows the answer. There is a legitimate question. And many people predicted this. Can this administration learn from experience? But there's one issue and one issue only internationally that they may have learned, and I say this tentatively. They may have learned that if they make a high priority of Israeli-Palestinian negotiations, it'll make them look really foolish, and it will fail. That may be the one thing they learned, and therefore they may keep off of that, especially because there are now so many other things in the Middle East they have to do. Every country is different, and one of the most important things is to understand the differences between the countries. Let me point out something here. The Saudis are partly insulated because 90% of the population is Sunni and 10% of the population is Shia. And Wahhabi Islam is extremely anti-Shia. So therefore, a kind of pro-Iran or Islamist revolt can be portrayed as Shia. And in fact, what we saw was sectarian rioting, and Shias were shot and killed by the Saudi security forces. In addition to that, they know that the key person in the opposition in the past is Osama bin Laden. And a lot of people don't want to risk losing everything, and they have a lot to lose. In addition to that, the people who are doing the main push are mild reformist intellectuals who would be satisfied with relatively small changes, and who also are very much aware of how conservative their country is. So there are some real natural controls on the Saudi situation. In Bahrain, the centrality of the Shia-Sunni issue is very central. In Egypt, there is no, and I could talk about, we know about Iraq, of course, the role that the Sunni-Shia-Kurdish issue has played. Egypt doesn't have that, because although 10 to 15% of the population are Christians, nobody pays any attention to what they want anyway. So there was no check there, which is different. You know, Lebanon, you have it. In Jordan, you have it. In Egypt, you didn't have it. So I'll tell this story really fast. Shortly after the assassination of Sadat, I was asked to give a briefing on Egypt to Mr. Toyota. This is the head of the Toyota car company, and he didn't speak any English. So he asked, so we talked, and I said, look, the situation is stable, the regime will survive. We did the whole thing. And then he asked a question in Japanese, which was translated, and the question is, on what date will the Saudi monarchy fall? And the guy who was managing our delegation said, we know the date and we're willing to tell you, but first we want to renegotiate our fee structure. But the point is, you know, that was 30 years ago, and the Saudi regime is there and it's still not threatened. You know, people like to say in advance, afterward, oh, they should have known, it was obvious that the Egyptian regime was going to... Nonsense. I mean, it's not true, although I will say that people have noticed that in the WikiLeaks, the U.S. Embassy in Tunisia did warn that there was a significant threat of upheaval there, so they got it right. One of the things WikiLeaks showed us is a lot of the State Department reporting is pretty good, it's just not listened to. During the 1990s, there were two basic viewpoints. Everyone from the center to the left said that Arafat would make a peace agreement and keep it. And everyone from the center to the right said Arafat would make a peace agreement and break it. And they were all wrong. Actually, Ehud Yari was the only one. Right. Arafat didn't make an agreement at all. See, because the left would say, we offered him so much, he'll make an agreement, he wants to have a state. And they were wrong. And the right said, you're offering him too much, he'll take it, and then he'll use it against us. And they were wrong. So out of that came, and there was much less bitterness between those two sides than I would have expected. So out of that came a new national consensus. And the new national consensus, which vast majority supports, is Israel is ready to have a two-state solution. It's ready to accept an independent Palestinian state. But it will only do so if it's really, really, really clear that this is an agreement that meets our interests and will last, and in addition to that, we don't believe there's any partner for peace. They're not going to do it. They don't want to do it. They can't do it. Now, that's not just a left-right thing. Okay, this is what I think, I don't know, 70% plus of Jewish voters think, regardless of what party they vote for. So, the other position is the debate is over how publicly we should look like we're trying and offering. But people don't believe it. I was standing next to a well-known Israeli intellectual. He turned to me and he said, "When do you think there'll be Israeli-Palestinian peace?" And I said, "Well, I'm very pessimistic, 40 or 50 years." He said, "You call that pessimistic? 100 years. So you will hear interviewed, they're the people they like, who they keep quoting in NPR, and they don't represent much. So that's the view. Peace is not an option. Getting along on a day-to-day basis and trying to make the status quo as painful as possible and trying to keep terrorism at a minimum, and then going about our business of building, developing, and inventing and prospering. And I think that really characterizes the mood in the country. Now, the fact is the left shot its bolt. I'm a Civil War reenactor, so I know what it means to shoot your bolt. They're discredited. And I think Netanyahu will win the next election. I have no doubt about it. And despite discontent over various things, including gasoline prices, he'll win. Because there's no alternative. There's no alternative. And we have to deal with Iran, and we have to deal with those things. So I think it's pretty clear. And the country has done very well. Economically, there have been layoffs, there have been problems, but compared to OECD countries, the 2010 economic figures are terrific. So terrorism is about as low as it's ever been. So things are going well. We have our worries and concerns. We're going to have to deal with Egypt, the new Egypt situation, but we'll manage it. I have no doubt about that. So that's why I'm an optimist. And also because, and this is a good point to conclude on, because if we are honest and accurate and self-critical and really try to understand the world the way it is and not be deluded by a priori ideology or wishful thinking, then we'll do very well. Because that's what it takes. And if other countries don't do that, if they blind themselves to threats, if they lie to themselves, if they hide facts, then they're going to face serious problems. And I'm distressed to say that that's what I see. But of course, I should say that 50% of the population doesn't accept any of those things. We should never forget that point. There is a Congress of the United States, and the Washington Post seems to have rediscovered a bit of journalistic integrity. So this too shall pass. Thank you very much. And if you do want to get our publications, give me your email. And I want to thank my hosts for arranging this and for all of you for coming. Thank you.